report a nuclear accident, there are victims. The Soviet Union said tonight there's been a serious nuclear accident at one of its plants. It said there had been some casualties. It's not known how many or how badly hurt they are. Significant radiation has reached Scandinavia. The Soviets first denied Swedish reports, but then admitted for the first time something had gone wrong and there were victims. The leak happened at the Chornobyl nuclear plant in the Ukraine, and by this evening its radiation had been recorded in Sweden, Finland, Denmark and Norway. Although higher than normal, the radiation was said to be harmless to people. Tonight, the National Radiological Protection Board here said even if the fallout reached Britain, it couldn't cause any harm. Anti-nuclear groups said all nuclear programs should now be stopped.
It was at power stations like this one at Forsmark in Sweden that scientists first detected the wave of radioactivity that swept over Scandinavia this afternoon. At Forsmark, 600 workers were evacuated. Police sealed off the station and workers were tested for radioactive contamination. Swedish authorities said tonight that the workers evacuated were not at risk and that levels of radiation were too low to pose a threat to the public. Nevertheless, Scandinavian scientists are sure the radioactivity came from the Soviet Union, and they're calling it the worst ever nuclear disaster.
This is almost certainly the most severe accident that has ever taken place in the short history of civilian nuclear power. The radioactivity that the reactor released has travelled at least 1,500 kilometres from the power station, which is near Kiev, to where it was picked up at Forsmark in Sweden. And the level of radioactivity that was picked up there was so intense that it triggered an alert and an evacuation of the Swedish power plant.
Soviet television news tonight admitted there had been an accident at a Soviet power station in Chornobylsk. People affected were being treated and there would be an official investigation. But the news was played down. It now seems certain that accident led to the radioactive cloud in Scandinavia. In Sweden, levels of contamination were illegally high. In Finland, levels of radiation were 6 times normal. In Denmark, 5 times normal. And in Norway, 50% up.
Civilians have been injured and that people are requiring and receiving medical treatment in the Soviet Union. So one can only imagine that this is a very severe accident indeed. It is certainly more severe than the 3 Mile Island accident, which took place in the United States some years back. It is more severe than the leak of radioactivity from the Sellafield.
Whether the cloud that hit Scandinavia will reach Britain is impossible to say, but experts are sure that if it does, it will pose no danger. It is, however, an indication that today could have seen the nuclear world's worst ever accident.
The Soviet Union said today that an accident has damaged an atomic reactor at a power plant near Kiev. It could be one of the world's worst nuclear accidents. The admission came after complaints from Scandinavian countries of a dramatic increase in radioactivity, and they even evacuated one of their own nuclear plants. We'll be asking independent nuclear consultant Walter Patterson how he thought it could have happened and how many lives are at risk. And we'll be asking exiled Soviet scientist Dr. Juris Medvedev how Soviets will react to the explosion at the Chornobyl atomic reactor, a reactor similar to that now proposed for Sizewell. But first, that explosion at a nuclear plant in the Soviet Union. What caused it and how many people did it hurt? Scanty information has come so far from the Soviets, but here's Peter Snow to help fill out the gaps.
It does now seem likely that sometime in the last couple of days there's been perhaps the worst accident in the short history of the world's nuclear power industry. The Russians may have been hoping they could contain it without having to release the news, as they appear to have tried to do so in an earlier accident in the Urals 19 years ago. But the fact that they've had to reveal it and admit that there are casualties suggests they're deeply worried about the scale of it. The first scientific judgments outside Russia is that there's no danger to life in Scandinavia, where the contamination was first picked up, and in Britain, the National Radiological Protection Board say the levels are so low that if it ever reached Britain, it should not cause any harm. Well, it was just 4 hours ago when Soviet viewers were watching their evening news bulletin and the announcer revealed that the accident had taken place. The official news agency TASS later added that aid was being given to those affected. The accident was at Chornobyl, a town of around 50,000 people, about 50 miles due north of Kiev in Ukraine, and around 300 miles southwest of Moscow. The city of Kiev alone has a population of some 1.5 million people. There is no news tonight of any evacuation, although TASS did say that measures were being taken, and I quote, to eliminate the consequences of the accident. The first sign of an accident came in Sweden, not in Russia, when a sudden rise in radiation levels set off alarms from the Forsmark nuclear plant. Workers were evacuated, the plant was shut down, but no leak was found there. When reports began coming in from other parts of Scandinavia, increased levels of radioactivity, Sweden began to suspect that the leak had occurred in the Soviet Union. Norway recorded only slightly higher levels, but in Denmark, radioactivity was detected 5 times greater than usual, similar to the readings in Sweden. But the highest levels, up to 10 times more than normal, occurred in Finland. The Swedish authorities say there is no danger to life there, despite the sudden increases in radioactivity. But it may give some indication just how big the leak was, that the nearest point of the Swedish coast is 700 miles from the site of the disaster in the Ukraine. Well, now, what's caused it, the Russians aren't saying. But at Chornobyl, they have 4 working reactors of 2 different types. And it appears from the likely scale of this accident that the one that went wrong was probably a pressurized water reactor. The central part of the pressurized water reactor is the reactor vessel, a huge cylinder of welded steel, about the size of a large room, but 3 stories high. Now, inside this reactor vessel, right in the center of the picture there, cooled by water under heavy pressure, is the reactor core, a bunch of metal tubes packed with the highly radioactive uranium oxide, whose intense heat is removed by the circulating water to the steam generator, which in turn powers the turbines that generate electricity. What may have happened is a rupture in that very hot, high-pressure water circuit. The water may have leaked out enough to uncover the rods in the reactor vessel, which might then melt due to their own intense heat, releasing radioactivity into the water and steam and out through the leak into the atmosphere. Now, this is just what might have happened at the 3 Mile Island power plant in Pennsylvania 7 years ago when a valve stuck open there, except that there, in Pennsylvania, the reactor was enclosed in a massive concrete containment building, and this trapped almost all the radioactivity. We don't know for certain whether the Chornobyl reactor had a containment building. Some Soviet reactors do not have them. Now, since the advent of nuclear power about 30 years ago, there's been a series of leaks and accidents. 3 Mile Island in 1979 in Pennsylvania was America's worst. A breakdown in the cooling system caused the partial meltdown there. 4 years earlier, at Browns Ferry in Alabama, a fire put out the plant's control room. Britain's worst accident was in 1957 when fire destroyed the core of a plutonium-producing reactor at Windscale. Clouds of radioactivity were released and 2 million litres of milk were contaminated. In 1974, now we have, I've just been speaking to Brian Hanrahan on the phone to Moscow.
After this radiation was emerging, did run into, I think that's the only way of putting it, an official from the Foreign Office at a reception this evening and said to him, I'm making an official request. My government would like to know what's going on. And that was an official request, and it went in. He has yet, as I'm talking at the moment, to receive a reply. He, like everybody else, is getting his information from the wires. So there's no indication of what the official response is. There is obviously a lot of response in the embassies where people are trying to keep up with what's going on.
How important, Brian, to Soviet nuclear power capacity is the loss of this reactor, do you think?
Well, the indications are that this is one of a particular sort of reactor which makes up about half of the 30 reactors which are estimated to be in operation in the Soviet Union at the moment. So if that particular design is suspect, it means that that particular group have got to be looked at generally, and this is the time when they are planning to expand their capacity in nuclear power, and they need it quite badly for the new industrial push that Mr. Gorbachev is anxious for. In the short term, I would have thought the more immediate problem is that they have most of these plants grouped in one area or in one half of the country over in the European side of the Soviet Union, which is short of natural power resources. And this complex has not only 4 working reactors, one of which we know has been damaged, but also has 2 which are under construction. So if that is the case, it means if all these things are going on, if there is damage to one of them, if it is a problem, if it has affected the others, if they can't use the others, that means they have lost 4 working reactors and 2 new ones at a stroke, which would mean that area is going to be short of electricity.
Brian Hanrahan, thank you very much indeed. Well, now, what's thought to have been the worst Soviet nuclear incident happened almost 30 years ago near the town of Kishtim in the Urals. The Russians never explained what happened, but Western experts believe it was an explosion of nuclear waste. Pictures taken recently from an American satellite flying high above the Soviet Union show the area of the devastation, right in the middle of the picture there, labelled devastated area, to be very large and still quite evident. Now, the man who first revealed that this accident had taken place was Yuriy Medvedev, who's just even more recently written a biography of the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, and he's with me now. Yuriy Medvedev, what happened in the Urals, and do you think this is as bad as that?
In Urals, the accident was actually the explosion of nuclear disposal site from military reactors. For many years, the Soviet military reactors used to dispose nuclear waste into the one place, supposed to be lake, which later dried out, and finally accumulation of heat and some other chemical processes made chemical explosion, which brought all this nuclear waste material into the air and covered by the cloud, very large area not far from Chelyabinsk.
How many people do you think died in that disaster?
From what is known about the population in this area, at least 32 villages had been destroyed or evacuated and not inhabited anymore. So approximately 10,000–12,000 people who lived there did get radiation.
Now, that disaster was not revealed by the Soviet government. This one has been. What does that tell you?
First of all, this one happened in a very densely populated area, while Ural disaster happened in a very sparsely populated area, very far from central population centers of European part of the Soviet Union. So it's impossible to conceal this accident. So a lot of people in Ukraine and in Kiev apparently know about this. So it's impossible to keep it covered up.
Walter Patterson is one of leading experts on nuclear generation. Mr. Patterson, what, first of all, do you think happened this time in Chernobyl?
Well, if the reactor was a pressurized water reactor of Soviet design, any kind of major break in the primary circuit would have allowed the water in the reactor to flash to steam, the cooling to become ineffective, possibly some of the core to become uncovered, in which case there then might have been fuel melting, fuel damage of some kind, which would release radioactivity into the surroundings. If, as seems to be the case, there was no containment around the reactor, as is the general...
Can we be sure of that? What do you think, George Medvedev? Do you think there was a containment building?
I don't think that there is containment building, because the policy of Soviet atomic constructors was that reactors are absolutely safe, and so there is no need to have this kind of precaution, because it indicates possibility of disaster, which Russian always considered absolutely impossible.
So can we be clear about this? You're going as far as to say you think it almost certain or just probable that there was no protective shield around this reactor which appears to have melted down?
No, I think that there is no protection shield around this reactor. It's certainly the case, because the building as such indicates that there is no shield.
Now, Walter Patterson, if that is so, what is the danger to life if what you believe happened in the immediate area and beyond?
Well, obviously, if radioactivity got as far as Scandinavia, however long it took to get there, a great deal must have escaped close to the site. It depends, of course, on local weather conditions and on how severe the damage to the plant itself was. But there must have been some considerable amount of radioactivity dumped into the surrounding area, to the town of Chornobyl itself, which I gather has a population of maybe 50,000 people. It seems as though it may have been fortunate that the prevailing wind appears to have been in the northerly direction, northbound, rather than to the south in the direction of Kiev. I don't know what the meteorological conditions were at the time. But
would there be any danger, for example, to places like Moscow, 300 miles away to the northeast?
I think that the danger begins to get very much less serious there. But the corollary is that it is not only an immediate danger to the people who are there when the radioactive plume passes over, but that plume may deposit radioactivity on the ground, which will then continue to be a hazard for the people who stay in the area. This may present the Soviet authorities with a massive evacuation problem.
Medvedev, would you guess that they are now evacuating at least the people of that town itself?
Yes, I'm quite certain, because if there are casualties, as they admit, from radiation, people are not killed immediately unless it's very major, actually, disaster. So if there are casualties just now and admitted, it means that thousands of more people had got radiation from isotopes and radioactive materials and must be evacuated very quickly. So this is the case with radiation. If radiation does kill few people, this means that thousands of people were affected.
What, in much broader terms and looking much further ahead, what sort of danger do you think there is to people, or might be to people, way beyond the immediate area? I'm talking about now in Poland, across the Baltic, Scandinavia, and even Western Europe.
Well, this plume has obviously traveled a good long distance, and it must have dropped a good deal of radioactivity under it as it traveled. I think that the danger will have abated rapidly once you get away from the immediate locality of the site, by which I mean a radius of maybe some tens of miles. But it may be, nevertheless, a moderate long-term hazard, depending on what kind of radioactivity it is. We haven't been told yet what kind of radioactivity has been in that cloud. No. If it's long-lived radioactivity, it will continue to be a hazard.
Right. Now, what about the effects on the Soviet nuclear power industry of this disaster?
I think it may well turn out to be serious, because the Soviet industry has been in the process of trying to reactivate its nuclear power program after a long period of doldrums, and they have been relying particularly on the design of reactor, which seems to have been involved in this accident, as being the basis for a major new construction program. They will obviously have to think hard as to whether they can continue with such a program, given that this has now become public knowledge in the Soviet Union, and given the immediate local consequences and the national awareness of the problem that's been created.
Dr. Medvedev, briefly, how much of a blow to Mr. Gorbachev and his plans for the Soviet nuclear industry?
No, the Soviet Union has so-called energy program for the year 2000, which is major long-term program to increase the generation of electricity, and the major source of increasing electricity was considered as nuclear power stations. So it was an attempt to increase nuclear power station capacities at least by a factor of 6.
Now, finally, and very important as well, Walter Patterson, could this happen here?
If the reactor which has had the accident in Chernobyle was one of the pressurized water reactors at Chernobyle, even that is not yet certain. But if it was, then that will have an impact on nuclear power programs all over the world, because that is the most popular design of nuclear power reactor. It is the design that the UK government wants to start building in Britain at Sizewell B, followed by perhaps another half a dozen plants of the same type.
But it would have a containment building around it at Sizewell.
It would have a containment building, but the fact remains that if you can have that kind of accident, even the economic consequences can be crippling, to say nothing of the health hazard.
Walter Patterson, Royce Medvedev, thank you very much for joining us. Olivia.
And if there's any more news on that Soviet nuclear accident, we'll bring it to you during the program.
Of fuel resources in the highly populated European part of the USSR, the Soviet plan lays down an immense building program for nuclear power in the European area. And in fact, by 1990, according to the plan that's just been passed by the Party Congress, 20% of all electricity is to be generated by nuclear power. That's something like twice as much as being generated now. So that could set back very considerably Gorbachev's plans.
With Soviet oil production down and world oil prices plunging, this couldn't have come at a worse time for Mr. Gorbachev. Nuclear power has become the big hope to plug the energy gap. His plans for modernization are bound up with more power from the atom. Only 2 months ago, a glossy publication for Americans, Soviet Life, was crooning over the Chornobyl plant as a model of safety. There was no danger, it said, quoting the Ukraine's Minister of Power, in having towns next to the nuclear plant. He put the odds of a meltdown at 1 in 10,000 years.
Well, it's actually very damaging to Soviet pride in political sense. First of all, it unfortunately happened just before their big celebration of May Day, which is very close. The parade and demonstration and speeches, all about the advantages of Soviet technology, Soviet state, Soviet system. And this is the area where they claim to be first in the world. And this disaster does show that it's not always perfect.
Well, in Britain, safety regulations at nuclear installations are more stringent than they are in the Soviet Union, so a worst-case scenario, as they say in the industry, would seem less likely to come about here. Certainly, in the case of the Chornobyl accident, there is no likely danger of fallout in this country, as Ian Smith now reports.
Here at the National Radiological Protection Board at Harwell, they say there is no danger to Britain. But the director, John Dunster, is concerned about the consequences for the Russians.
But it does seem to have been a very bad accident, and I would guess, it's little more than a guess, I would guess that people within maybe a kilometre, maybe 5 kilometres of the reactor in the downwind direction, if the release was fairly sudden and they were unprotected, might have received doses which will prove lethal in the fairly short term.
What do you mean, a week or so?
Yeah, in a week or so.
Now, what would the first indication be that they were suffering from some radiation sickness?
They'd feel nausea. If it was due very largely to inhalation of radioactive dust, they might begin to feel difficulty in breathing. And soon after that, they would be seriously incapacitated, and within a few weeks, they'd be likely to be dead.
What do you think the effects on the Soviet environment are going to be?
Well, the main thing in the short term is that agricultural produce will be contaminated. The crops on the surface, if there is grazing animals and milk production and so on, then there's no doubt that the milk will be unfit for consumption. So probably will be meat from grazing animals. Surface vegetables will be also unsuitable for consumption. Over a longer period, there will be contamination of the soil, and there will have to be some fairly careful assessments made as to whether that soil can be used again in the course of the next maybe few decades even.
If we'd had an accident here in this country, like the Russians have had, what would we have done?
We have, all our reactor sites have emergency schemes, and there's a national backup system. It depends very much on the timescale. The first move would be to tell people to stay inside their houses until an assessment can be made, because staying inside the house gives you quite a lot of protection. Immediately after that, if the accident was still going on, I think we would have tried to get people out for a distance of some 10, maybe 20 kilometres.
So a complete evacuation of the area?
Of the downwind area.
Of the downwind area. And is that what you would expect the Russians themselves to be doing now?
I would have thought it was very likely.
Today, as well as asking the Swedes for assistance in dealing with the accident at Chornobyl, the Soviet Union also made a surprising approach this morning to the West German nuclear industry. These inquiries were made to the German Atomic Forum, and early this evening I asked the Forum's Secretary General what form the approach from the Russians had taken.
Well, I think it was the most direct approach you can imagine. This morning, a representative of the
We've lost that recorded interview with the Secretary General of the German Atomic Forum. Here he is once again, I trust.
Information and help how to handle a graphite fire. Obviously, we were informed before about the fact that there had been a nuclear incident in a power station in the Soviet Union. So we, of course, immediately made the link between the two. We did our best to find throughout Germany specialists either on fire protection or on graphite and graphite behavior. And we felt to our great satisfaction that all these German colleagues immediately accepted to grant their assistance and even to if necessary, to go to the Soviet Union to be available on hand.
Do you mean that advice and assistance was given over the telephone, or what?
It was partly given over telephone, but partly detailed where details were necessary. Everybody was immediately ready to help if necessary and if asked so. We passed this readiness on to our Soviet colleague, and now I would say, probably fortunately, up to now, there seems to be no necessity for the Soviets to rely on foreign assistance. We can optimistically conclude from this, and latest reports from Moscow seem to confirm this, that the event was less disastrous than in the early moments it had been believed.
Are you saying that, as far as you understand it, at this stage in the evening, the incident has been more or less brought under control?
It seems so, that the Soviet side does not require additional help from, at least from Germany, and apparently neither from other countries. We conclude from this that they have now succeeded to have the situation well in hand, and I do not hesitate to be happy about that.
Nevertheless, the incident itself was thought to be extremely serious. How seriously now do you actually judge it to have been?
Well, even if the situation is now well in hand, this undoubtedly remains for the time being certainly the most serious incident in civil nuclear power generation which has happened since the inception of nuclear power generation.
Well, Lord Marshal, you just heard Dr. Rosa there saying that the situation appears to be well in hand, and yet earlier we heard the view from Washington that the crisis was by no means over. To which view do you yourself incline?
There's probably truth in both. I would be more cautious. The fact that they detected radiation in Sweden, which after all is 700 miles away, means that it was a big accident. And I would be very surprised if, when we know all the details, we don't conclude that it's the biggest nuclear event that we've had. So it's a nasty accident, I'm sure of that.
Could it be as bad as we heard Tim Sebastian reporting from Washington earlier, the top of a reactor being blown right off?
Well, I've heard that report also, and certainly if it was a chemical explosion in that type of reactor, that could be possible. And it would be possible to reconcile all the various comments that your reporters have made in this program, because the Russians may have the one reactor under control, but these reactors are built in pairs, and so we have to be a little cautious about making sure that they have the other one under control and closed down. And I think we would be wise not to jump to conclusions one way or the other for several days.
But in the meantime, it would perhaps also be wise to surmise that emissions from one or other of the reactors may well be continuing.
Yes, we don't actually know, because the Russians haven't given us very much hard information. But, you know, for something to reach 700 miles into Sweden means that it was quite considerable.
What do you think of the opinion given by the Russian civil aviation minister in the United States this evening that the incident will have no lasting effect on anything?
Well, I think I agree with the comment made by your Swedish nuclear inspector. It's hard to believe that that will be the case. I think it's very difficult to avoid the conclusion that that type of reactor is going to have a very big question mark after it. It's a very strange reactor, a very strange one altogether. There's nothing like it in the West. Its proper name is a boiling water pressure tube graphite moderated reactor, We have nothing like it in the West. It's a straightforward extension of the Russian reactors which they use to make plutonium for their weapons program.
But we do have graphite components, don't we?
Yes, this reactor has a little bit from a little bit like our graphite reactors, a little bit like the Canadian pressure tube reactors, a little bit like the American boiling water reactors, but it's not actually like any of them. It's a strange hybrid, and it has certain unsatisfactory safety factors which would forbid it from ever getting a license either in this country or in any Western country, in my opinion.
But isn't one of the psychological impacts of the incident at Chernobyl bound to be that question marks are raised over nuclear power generation in this country and elsewhere in the West too?
I mean, international nuclear business is international, and you can't expect the general public to be too knowledgeable about the difference of reactor types. I mean, they are very different, but the general public just thinks of it as nuclear power. So obviously it's a setback. I mean, it's not a setback so far as I can see in any logical sense, but as you said, psychologically, it's a bad event indeed. A very serious one, in my opinion, as best we can judge today.
Lord Marshal, thanks very much indeed.
Nuclear power disaster. The number of people killed still stands at 2, but they say 197 have been taken to hospital, and of these, 49 have already been discharged. But 3 days after the disaster, the Soviet Union is still maintaining an extraordinary degree of secrecy about exactly what is going on in the area around the plant. These are the key points to have emerged today. At the plant itself, the Russians claim everything's under control. But a very different picture has come from officials in Washington. They say the plant is still burning, with 2 reactors affected. All across North and Eastern Europe, people have been taking precautions as the nuclear cloud passes over. Babies are being given iodine to protect them. And around 100 British students are being evacuated from Kiev and Minsk, close to the scene of the accident. We have reports from our correspondents in Moscow and in Washington. We start in London, where the new Soviet ambassador, Mr. Zamyatin, has given what amounts to the first public account of what's happened by any high-ranking Soviet official. He answered reporters' questions outside Downing Street, where he'd been to see Mrs. Thatcher.
What about the reports over here, Ambassador, that several thousand people have been killed in the accident?
That's not true.
That's not true?
That's not.
Was Mrs. Thatcher annoyed that you didn't tell the West earlier about this accident?
Well, we informed the government of the United Kingdom this morning about this accident officially.
That's very late.
We have talked with the Prime Minister just now about this problem too.
Have you asked for British help?
Well, we don't ask the help, but the Prime Minister suggested us the help from the British side, so did the Americans.
While Mr. Zamyatin was speaking, Soviet television put up its first picture of the Chornobyl reactor. The single still photograph showed a building with a damaged roof, and the commentator said it showed that reports of massive destruction and large-scale fire were false. The state-controlled television said the chain reaction in the core of the plant had been stopped, and the reactor was now shut down. But it said nothing about Western reports that another reactor at the site might also be going into a meltdown. The newsreader repeated that only 2 people had died. He added that 197 had gone to hospital, but said 49 had already been discharged. The broadcast, part of the main evening news, was the fullest Soviet account yet of what had happened at the station, and it criticized Western news media for reporting thousands of deaths. It ended by promising more details in future. Until now, Soviet papers, like the broadcasters, have given little attention to the disaster. They've carried only brief items inconspicuously placed, and despite growing international concern, refused to say anything either to their own people or foreigners in the country about the dangers of radioactive contamination. Also on Soviet television tonight were pictures of Kiev, the nearest big city to the accident site. Amid the preparations for tomorrow's May Day celebrations, it showed life going on normally. The TASS news agency reports that the radiation situation in the region is improving and being monitored.
In Washington, the Pentagon has been analyzing intelligence data and has leaked its findings. It now believes a second reactor may have melted down at the Soviet power plant, causing fresh contamination. That's not confirmed by the presidential task force set up to review the accident. But they too reject Soviet claims that the situation has stabilized.
We know that a fire occurred, and then we have a continuing fire at that facility, and that we have damage and the fire at that one unit.
I would expect that today the charcoal is still burning, probably burning from the top down. There's still very high temperatures existing in the core. The radiation levels within the plant itself are so very high that I would expect it to be very difficult to take any corrective action there.
And that's not all. The Americans now regard the accident as an international disaster and are watching the spread of radioactivity with some concern.
The coverage of the radioactive cloud is really quite large, we think, based on past experience from the movement of pollution. So that, say, from the initial event, our guess would be that it's covering probably a good part of Eastern and Northern Europe, probably northwestern part of the Soviet Union, and may extend well into the Arctic Basin.
The State Department confirmed there'd been a fresh meeting with Soviet officials here, but they'd learned little that was new.
We've expressed our desire to have additional details. We do believe that the Soviet Union should notify other states of such events, of the possibility of transboundary effects of the incident, and to furnish them with the information necessary to address these effects.
And that underlies the increasing impatience now being felt in the administration. For there's a growing gap between the accounts of the accident from Moscow and Washington, but a strong impression tonight that the accident is still running out of control. This is Tim Sebastian for the 9 o'clock news in Washington.
So the Americans are presenting one version of the disaster, the Soviets another. But if it's true that Soviet teams are still fighting a fire at the reactor, they've a big problem. No one has experience of dealing with reactor fires quite like this before, so no one's sure of the best way of tackling it. In the meantime, many thousands of people living in the area could still be in danger from nuclear fallout. Our science correspondent, James Wilkinson.
This is what the Chornobyl nuclear plant looked like before the disaster. And this photograph, taken shortly after the accident, shows the extent of the explosion. The reactor building on the right has been completely destroyed. The jagged edges of the walls, identified by the Americans on satellite photographs, can be seen on the right. It was shortly after this that the fire took hold. That fire has apparently got worse in the last 24 hours. Now it's believed all the 1,000 tons of graphite inside the reactor is ablaze. British nuclear workers have regular emergency drill, but on a minor scale compared with what the Russians now face. The Russians could try water to put the fire out by remote control, but using too little might feed the fire. The explosion was probably caused by steam from the cooling water reacting with the hot graphite in the reactor, making hydrogen, which blew the lid off. They could try nitrogen or carbon dioxide gas to starve the fire of oxygen, but they'd need so much it probably couldn't be done. But there are other ideas.
Or sand or some other inert substance is quite an attractive idea. The Russians have got military helicopters with very great lifting power. They can lift tens of tons, perhaps even 100 tons of sand at one lift. And it is conceivable, therefore, to fly over the top of the ruptured building and drop sand bombs onto it, in this way trying to smother the blaze.
Isn't that dangerous for the pilots in that radioactivity?
Certainly it would be very dangerous. It's not conceivable that enough shielding could be put around such a helicopter to protect the pilots, and so one would have to rely on flying in and out very quickly so as to limit their period of exposure to radiation.
What about the possibility of just letting it burn?
I think in the event, that may be just exactly what they have to do.
The Americans now say a second reactor may well be affected. But there is some doubt about how much of the nuclear fuel in the core has actually melted down. Key chemicals with radioactivity lasting thousands of years, like plutonium, have not apparently been detected in the plume. This could mean the fuel hasn't reached the very highest temperatures, making a full meltdown unlikely. But meltdown or not, the Russians clearly have a baffling problem on their hands, one the world has never faced before.
First-hand reports of the devastation around the plant have been hard to come by. An Israeli radio ham tuned into another amateur from Kiev and picked up this account. Within 6 miles of the plant, experts in the West have said that many hundreds may have died, and they're talking about a nuclear wasteland stretching 100 miles, where the countryside may be contaminated for years to come and nobody can live. It's a region of rich agricultural land, known as Russia's breadbasket, that's at risk. The Ukraine produces 1/4 of the Soviet Union's grain harvest. But it's the people who must now be the authorities' main concern. Today it's become clear that many near the plant have already been evacuated. It's thought that iodine tablets will have been distributed over a wide radius to try to stop radioactive fallout causing cancers, especially among those closest to the disaster.
Radiation doesn't kill people immediately. The first symptoms, even of a heavy dose, would be nausea and sickness. If the dose were above the lethal level, people might recover for a few days or even a week or two, and then there would be a recurrence. They would have further nausea and vomiting, they would lose fluids, and in due course they would die.
At the moment, though, the people in the cities, towns and villages of the Ukraine just haven't been told what dangers they may face.
Particles from the radioactive cloud which poured out after the explosion have now been detected in many parts of Europe. Outside the Soviet Union, levels of radiation are not high enough to be a big danger to health, but many countries are still taking precautions. It's known that the cloud contains radioactive iodine that can accumulate in the brain and cause cancer. And there's cesium, another radioactive poison which may have contaminated ground and crops for miles around the plant, and it's potent for years. But so far there's no sign of plutonium, the most dangerous radioactive chemical which lasts for thousands of years.
The fallout from the explosion was carried northwest from Chornobyl over the northeast of Poland. There, a ban's been imposed on sales of milk from cows which may have grazed on contaminated ground. There are queues for powdered milk and tinned food. In some areas, children and pregnant women are being given iodine to try to protect them against the effects of radioactivity. And Britons in Poland have been told they should wash their children's hair and clothes every day.
The cloud was blown further north over Sweden, where the danger was first detected. On the east coast, high radioactive levels have been found in pools and in rainwater. Contaminated milk has also been found. And food imports from East European countries have been banned. Scientists monitoring levels of radiation say it has fallen, but they're keeping a close watch on it.
Now the winds are taking the radioactive clouds south. It's reached Austria and Switzerland and is heading back towards Russia. In parts of Austria, parents have been advised to keep their babies indoors. Grocers have been told not to display fruit and vegetables out of doors, but the authorities say radioactive levels are not dangerous yet. Fear of the radioactive fallout is driving more and more Britons out of the Soviet Union. 84 language students, most of them British, have tonight begun their long journey from Kiev, about 100 miles from Chernobyl to Moscow. Some of the first tourists to leave Russia since the disaster have been arriving back in London. Carol Walker reports.
Tourists arriving at Heathrow from Moscow tonight were clearly relieved to be back, though most knew little about what had happened.
It was very scary this morning when we first heard. It was quite a sort of melodramatic announcement at breakfast. And we then actually carried on and did what we were going to do.
I passed Kiev by train.
What did you see?
I think I heard that today about the accident, and I was very afraid.
It's a call from the States.
Tonight, a London travel agency, Progressive Tours, who organised a trip for 84 language students to Kiev, confirmed they're all on board a train bound for Moscow. They're expected back in Britain tomorrow. For the past 2 days, the travel agency has been swamped with calls from parents. Many are clearly very worried.
Tina's only 22 years of age. In 10 years' time, Tina could have cancer. All I want is somebody to tell me how to get Tina out of Russia, that's all.
Many travel agencies have cancelled holidays in the Soviet Union. Britain's biggest tour operator, Thomson's, has suspended all its trips there and is sending a special plane to bring 180 holidaymakers and staff back from Leningrad and Moscow. The Foreign Office say the operation to evacuate Britons may have to be extended.
Obviously, we have now set up a group of experts, and they will be advising us on a regular basis as to, on the basis of the latest information, obviously, as to exactly where our travel advisory notice should cover.
The Foreign Office have set up 2 special phone lines for anyone concerned about friends or relatives in the Soviet Union. They are 01 213 3716 and 01 213 5866.
And then this degenerated into despair. Getting into print in the Soviet Union with such criticisms is not so simple. Hence, the punches are apparently pulled. One thing Lyubov Kovalevska had going for her, though, is that she was writing and criticizing in the new Gorbachev spirit. One headline for her article is "The decisions of the 27th Party Congress being put into action." The official writers' newspaper in Kiev uses this justification apparently for printing it. At the February Party Congress, the party leader Mikhail Gorbachev urged on the Soviet people the need for self-criticism in their work. It is ironic and tragic to find these words being implemented in this way over Chornobyl. Referring to construction, she goes on to say, lack of organisation weakened not only discipline, but also responsibility of each person for the overall result of the work. The impossibility and unwillingness of engineering workers to organise teamwork further lowered standards. She homes in particularly on the delays to work on the 5th reactor complex, the poor quality of materials and of equipment used for construction, fatigue of equipment, machines and mechanisms of Chernobyl's atomic power station was beginning to be felt. The lack of tools and instruments, in a word, all the deficiencies of the building process, which are unfortunately typical, became apparent. It is a sorry tale, and she says the deadline for completion of the 5th complex has been brought forward from 3 to 2 years. So the implication is something has to suffer. Would she, one wonders, have written a similar critique about the earlier reactor complexes when they were being built? In citing these facts, I would like, she says, to draw attention to the inadmissibility of deficiencies in building atomic power stations in general, where each structure must conform to a certain standard, each cubic metre of reinforced concrete must guarantee reliability and thus safety. 4 weeks later, 1 reactor at least blew up.
Meanwhile, in Western Europe, there's growing awareness on both sides of the debate about nuclear power that this disaster in the Ukraine could massively reinforce the environmentalist case against it. And nowhere is this awareness more palpable than in Sweden. In Stockholm today, it's reported that the Russians have admitted that the explosion at Chornobyl happened on Saturday. Earlier, the Soviet ambassador assured the Swedish government that information about any further problems would be made available. But no mention was made of the second reactor now thought to be involved. In Sweden, the first country to report the effects of the accident, scientists are measuring increasing levels of radioactivity. From there, Nick Clark now reports.
The town of Uppsala turns out in force to celebrate the end of a long winter. It's an historic ceremony, a day traditionally devoted to good cheer. But Uppsala today has another claim to fame. It lies in a hot spot, an area of Sweden still recording unusually high levels of radioactivity. And even as the carousing began, sober matters were being discussed 50 miles away in Stockholm.
There are several very long-lived varieties of cesium, half-lives of the order of years or even decades, and we have had unexpectedly high levels of cesium. And when they are going down, it's because the cesium is seeping down into the ground. It's not because it's decaying.
When you have it over you, you can't do anything about it, so then you just stop worrying.
The white caps symbolise the academic achievement of Uppsala's young. All thoughts of poisonous cesium with its 30-year half-life seeping into the ground around the town have been banished for the day. But not by everyone in the area. Scientists at the Swedish University of Agriculture are engaged in an urgent sampling exercise, with particular attention to rainwater which may have collected radioactive material as it fell. The monitoring, covering everything from soil and plants to milk and air, is being conducted by professionals and volunteers throughout the country, and the first firm warnings were issued today.
The problem is that we have measured very high, rather high levels of radioactive iodine in lying water, and if people drink this lying water in large quantities, they will get large doses to their thyroids, and this we want to avoid. So we have recommended that people do not drink lying water, water gathered from the roofs of summer houses and so on. We have no problems with the normal supply of water, municipal water. Running water is no problem, only lying water.
Back at the University of Agriculture, the warnings about standing water seem fully justified. The tester in this case was shaken by the reading for iodine radiation in the puddle outside. It was 1,000 times the normal level. But this type of radiation at least loses its potency quite quickly. Other isotopes linger for years or enter the food chain, and the long-term effects are unpredictable.
Cancer, genetic damage, and so on and so forth. And we have no real knowledge about these small levels, about the cancerogenic effects of these small levels. You cannot have this because so many other factors are of importance here.
For Anne-Marie Janssen, the whole affair is in many ways only too predictable. She's a member of the International Organization of Doctors, which won a Nobel Peace Prize for its campaign against nuclear weapons. If the world is so horrified at this nuclear accident, she says, how can it continue to accept the international development of much worse destruction?
How can you say that nuclear plants are not dangerous when we see what has happened now? I think this very simple question that can be posed by anybody in the street, anybody from the scientific community, will make a difference.
Will it make enough of a difference to end or to bring down the development of nuclear plants in this country, do you think?
I'm sure that no serious person, after what has happened now, can really take up a debate and say that we should promote nuclear energy in Sweden.
In Stockholm, the May Day holidays have now started in earnest with public firework and bonfire displays, the biggest of all at the Skansen Park on a bluff overlooking the city. So, as the fireworks light up the Stockholm sky tonight, there are many unanswered questions about those much less friendly explosions last weekend at Chornobyl, and many questions which in Sweden may not be answered until the next century. Such are the uncertainties of this nuclear age.
Now, in Britain, as in Sweden, those who oppose nuclear power generation are marshalling their arguments and preparing their protests. A demonstration is planned tomorrow by Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth and the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament outside the Department of Energy in London. Afterwards, they'll be handing in a letter of protest to the Soviet embassy. And the British government is showing it's aware of the need to reassure the public on nuclear power. William Waldegrave, the Environment Minister, said today that tighter controls will be imposed on the discharge of radioactive waste into the Irish Sea. And the government says constant readings are being taken of the level of atmospheric radiation that may spread in from Eastern Europe. So how does the disaster in Russia fuel the argument for and against nuclear power in Britain? Western reactors, certainly British reactors, are so different, we are told, that what happened in Chernobyl would not happen here. Some experts reject that.
I think that's outrageously complacent. The Soviet design includes constituents that are common to our Magnox reactors, that are common to CANDU reactors, that are common to American boiling water reactors. And I don't think we know yet that it is any unique combination of those attributes that caused this accident.
The first attribute at issue is containment. Chernobyl has no pre-stressed concrete shield over the plant to trap any escaping contamination. At 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, a similar leak 7 years ago was contained by a special concrete shield. And any new reactor built here in Britain would have that full-scale containment too. But some existing British reactors are not contained. Bradwell and the other 3 original Magnox reactors have parts of their piping outside any building. And neither they nor the next 4 Magnox stations at Dungeness, Hinkley Point A, Sizewell A, and Trawsfynydd in North Wales have containment buildings built of pre-stressed concrete.
Well, the difference is not as great as the CEGB would like to make out, because Britain's early reactors certainly don't have containment as is generally now understood, and even the most recent reactors don't have containment around the refueling machines and the penetrations in the top of the pile cap into the advanced gas-cooled reactors. So if there were a core disruptive accident in reactors of the British design, it is possible that radioactivity could escape into the environment. It is not, I admit, easy to see an accident of the kind that has happened at Chernobyl's happening in these designs of reactor, but until yesterday I had not any idea that it was possible that a Chernobyl-type accident could happen.
The second key issue is reactor design. The Soviet Chernobyl-type reactors have the uniquely dangerous combination of water and graphite. That is potentially explosive and may have caused the roof to blow off, as we've seen in today's picture. So if that is what happened, that couldn't happen here. But there's another piece of Soviet reactor design that's different too. The fuel rods at Chernobyl are cooled individually. Some believe that there are so many of these individual pressure tubes that they multiply the risk of leakage, compared with the widespread Western system of pooling all the coolant in one big pressure vessel that's less likely to rupture.
Until yesterday, pressure tubes were considered by some to be safer than pressure vessels, because a pressure vessel is all or nothing. If you have a breach of a pressure vessel, it exposes the entire reactor core, whereas if you have a break in a pressure tube, as happened in one of the CANDU reactors in Canada a couple of years ago, only that tube is affected and the fuel inside that tube. But it is now evident that there are other kinds of accident that can happen to a pressure tube reactor, which will expose all the fuel anyway. So I now don't think that there is very much to choose between the two designs.
Well, I'm now joined from Birmingham by Ron Campbell, Managing Director of Babcock Power, who has actually visited Chernobyl. Now, Mr. Campbell, can you tell us whether you agree with the broad thrust of what Walter Patterson was saying, that it would, in his judgment, be outrageously complacent to suggest that what happened in Russia couldn't happen here?
Well, I think we have to be clear, first of all, that the difference between the Russian reactors and our reactors is very significant. The wall which contains the water in the Russian reactor is something like 1/4 of an inch thick, and that is then the only barrier between water at 1,000 pounds per square inch and graphite, which is red hot. If that pressure tube then ruptures, which is a risk which in this country we would take as something that we would expect or we would anticipate we had to make protection against that accident. If that were to breach and the steam and water then reach the graphite, there is an exothermic reaction, which means that the heat is produced and gases which can burn carbon monoxide and hydrogen are formed from the water, and the pressure in the containment of the graphite would rise to such a point that that structure would not remain intact.
Mr. Campbell, all right, there may be differences between the two, but are there not enough similarities for people here to be very worried that something like what happened in Russia is now more likely to happen in the West?
No, I was just trying to tell you that the design is so different from what we have in the West.
I've taken that on board, but let me put one point to you that was made by Walter Patterson, that, and indeed we know it to be a fact, that there is no containment for a substantial number of British reactors, as there is no containment at Chernobyl.
The Russian reactor is much more difficult to protect against the failure in the first place. The British reactors are dependent on feeding carbon dioxide into the vessels if there is any failure of the vessel. And all the measures are there to feed in carbon dioxide in large quantity to stop any air getting in, and that then contains the accident. In Russia, there was no such protection.
Dr. Gillis, let me bring you in here. Let me ask you this broad question. Do you think that those who are campaigning against nuclear power in this country will be able to settle on what happened in Russia and use it as a powerful argument against nuclear power?
Well, you know, I'm sure they'll try, but I can't see that it is a powerful argument, and I think they will have great difficulty in adducing it as such. The central difference is the one which has just been explained by Ron Campbell. It is the fact that here we have a reactor consisting of an enormous block of graphite operating at red heat, and close by, separated by a thin wall of zirconium, there is live steam. Should the zirconium pressure tube fail, the steam can sear its way into the graphite, generating hydrogen and no doubt giving rise to the explosion which has destroyed the reactor. We have nothing like that in any of the plants operating or contemplated in the United Kingdom.
Ron Campbell, final question to you. What did you think of the evidence brought forward there by David Sells that there has been serious concern in Russia itself about the management of the Chernobyl plant?
Well, when I visited Russia, I was able to talk to the designers of this type of reactor and to the people who developed a lot of the equipment. And there were points which we were looking at that time. Stagnation is a very common point which is discussed here. That means that in a reactor, if there is a breach in the circuit, some point is not cooled because water flows in each direction away from that point. I raised the matter of stagnation with the Russians. They admitted that it could happen in a small channel, a small number of channels, but said that that was a risk they were prepared to take. Now, we would not be able to do that.
Thank you very much, Ron Campbell, and thank you to John Gitters.
So, in effect, you'd be making, after the event, a kind of containment building of a rough and ready kind round the reactor, which some people said should have been there in the first place.
No, not quite. Not quite. You'd
just make a layman's stab at it here.
You'd be sealing the core in sort of cellophane, effectively, chemical cellophane.
And how would the boron compound be?